As within the last 2 weeks, 2.5 million people have fled Ukraine already. That's an astonishing high number, even for us who are used to work in settings like that. It's exceptional in terms of scale.
That's the voice of Negar Tayyar, the co-founder and director at Global Whole-Being Fund. She's today's guest on Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now here are your co-hosts, Tom Collina and Michelle Dover. Thanks, Angela, and welcome back to Press the Button. Tom, how are you recovering from daylight savings, and how was your weekend?
Hey, Michelle. Great to see you. Yes, my weekend was too busy, but I did remember to change the clocks, mainly because it happens automatically. I think there's only one clock left in my house that isn't somehow connected to the interwebs. So I'm safe on that front. How was your weekend?
No, it had, I think, a little more snow than I expected, but looking forward to some warm weather in the coming weeks. But what do you have for us on nuclear news?
Well, there's too much going on. I think that's safe to say, and most of it is bad. But here we go. The war in Ukraine grinds on as the humanitarian crisis just seems to get worse. Russia struck a military site close to the Polish border, bringing the war closer to NATO. U.S. officials are saying that Russia is requesting economic and military assistance from China, which could bring Beijing into the conflict. You know, not surprisingly, there are increasing calls for the Biden administration to provide more military aid to Ukraine, including a no-fly zone over the country. And of course, while we can completely understand the desire to help Ukraine fight this war, we have to keep in mind the increasing U.S. involvement raises the risk of direct U.S.-Russian conflict and the possibility of escalation to nuclear war. President Biden has been doing a really good job, I think, so far of limiting U.S. involvement, but the political pressure is rising. And in a somewhat hopeful sign, Russia and Ukraine officials are holding peace talks today, so fingers crossed. Now, in a sign of how the war in Ukraine affects literally everything, negotiators took a pause from talks in Vienna on reviving the Iran nuclear deal due to last-minute demands from Russia related to the Ukraine war sanctions. And Russia's unwelcome intervention comes just as negotiators are reaching the final text to allow the United States and Iran to return to the 2015 deal. We'll have more on this in the show coming up. And finally, in this segment, as if things weren't bad enough in the Korean Peninsula, U.S. and South Korean officials said on Friday that North Korea tested what would be its largest intercontinental ballistic missile system in 2 recent launches, and that the North appears to be restoring some tunnels at its nuclear test site. And South Korea elected a new conservative president last week who intends to seek a reset with China and a tougher stance against North Korea. So there's the news. I sit down on early warning to talk more about the latest developments on the Iran nuclear talks with Sanam Vakil at Chatham House. It's a great conversation, so please stay tuned.
And after that, I sit down with Negar Tayyar, the co-founder and director at Global Whole-Being Fund, to talk more about the humanitarian crisis that is unfolding in Ukraine. We talk about how it compares to other refugee or displacement movements caused by conflict in the past few years, and how listeners specifically can help address the refugee crisis. We know that everyone is trying to help how they can. It's not just about learning and understanding what's going on, but also where you can put your time, energy, and resources. Here at Plowshares Funds, our grants provide support to those who are bringing you analysis and creative policy solutions to the nuclear dimensions of this crisis and opportunities to make your voice heard.
And as usual, if you like what you hear, remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Your feedback helps us improve the show. And with that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Del. So close and yet so far. After 11 months of talks in Vienna to revive the Iran nuclear deal, the process has hit a wall. Just as an agreement to bring the United States and Iran back into the deal seemed ready to go, Russia has thrown a wrench into the works. Russia, deep into its brutal war in Ukraine, is now saying it wants written guarantees from Washington that new Western sanctions related to the war would not harm Moscow's trade with Iran. In response, negotiators in Vienna are taking a break to decide what to do. So, is this the end of the road? Is there a way to get around Russia's demands? To help us understand how serious this is, we're joined by Dr. Sanam Vakil, the Deputy Director of the Middle East North Africa Program at Chatham House, where she works on Iran. Sanam, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So, Sanam, what can you tell us about Russia's actions in Vienna and how serious do you think this is?
This was sort of a unpredicted outcome after 11 months of negotiations. In this final hour, the Russians have thrown this wrench into the works and have demanded that the United States and Europe provide written guarantees that would protect Russia's trade with Iran. And this is, of course, a tactic that they are using because of the war in Ukraine to push back against US and Western actions in that front. And this definitely destabilizes and potentially creates a second crisis in the Middle East framework, where all sides have been working together and cooperating to bring these negotiations to fruition.
Now, what do you think is Russia's real motivation here? Is it about, as they say, protecting their trade with Iran? Or is it about keeping Iranian oil off the market to keep prices high? Or is it to keep tensions in the Middle East high? What do you think their real motivation is?
Let me take that in pieces. Russia-Iran trade is not particularly high. It amounts to, at maximum, $4 billion a year. So that is not huge amounts of trade that Russia is desperately seeking to protect. And while Russia and Iran have had pragmatic and longstanding relations and cooperation in certain frontiers and tensions in others, Russia is currently heavily under attack from US and European sanctions, under pressure because its campaign in Ukraine is perhaps not going according to plan. And it is effectively holding the JCPOA hostage in order to gain leverage, perhaps vis-a-vis Washington and European countries, perhaps to demonstrate that it has the capability of creating another crisis in an area that could weaken the Biden administration and other European countries. I think it also has perhaps something to gain by keeping Iranian oil off the market. But Russia also has diversified relations across the Middle East. It has, over the past few days, received phone calls from the Israeli Prime Minister Bennett. It has engaged with Gulf Arab leaders as well that have taken neutral, not necessarily pro-American positions in condemning the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So I think that Russia is playing a strategy to increase its leverage, up the ante, and perhaps win some favors among other Middle Eastern states as well.
And maybe just be a general agent of chaos to show the West that it can mess things up. Terrific. So if Russia does not change its position, and we're kind of stuck with Russia's take on this, is there a way to finish the Iran talks without Moscow? Is there a workaround, or are we stuck?
Well, that's the sort of predicament I think that all of the negotiating sides are weighing. The talks broke today, and all of the negotiators have returned home, I think, to strategize on how to move forward. There are a few outcomes that we could perhaps imagine. One, the talks break down completely. Two, perhaps this is a tactic coming from Tehran and also coming from Moscow to increase leverage and to extract further concessions from Washington and Europe on the JCPOA. Three, we could perhaps envisage the US and Europe trying to band-aid the situation and contain the crisis by offering Tehran a freeze while they look for workarounds and other scenarios to develop. And it's in nobody's interest to see Iran kick up and accelerate its nuclear program further. And also, it's not in the region's interest to see an acceleration of regional tensions at the same time. And I think a fourth outcome, perhaps that could develop farther afield, would be the possibility that the US and Iran decide to sidestep Russia, China, and Europe and sit down and hammer this out between themselves. I think that scenario is a bit farther afield and perhaps far-fetched because there are, of course, deep tensions and much mistrust between both sides, but that is another way to undercut Russia. Tehran will be weighing its options, and we shouldn't expect Tehran to necessarily walk away from the JCPOA without sweeteners and assurances that it has been demanding. But at the same time, Tehran has had a really transactional relationship with Moscow that has worked to its benefit. So I think there's going to be a debate in Tehran over the coming days where they weigh the risk and the reward of the JCPOA and the risk and the reward of this dynamic with Russia. Tehran is a loyal partner and it tends to stand by their relationship. So I'm just not certain how this is going to play out right now.
Nor are we, but I want to thank you so much for giving us your assessment of where we stand. This is obviously a developing, breaking story, so we'll keep after it, but we're going to have to leave it there for now. And Sanam, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us.
Thank you for having me on, Tom. It was great to talk to you.
Hi, my name is Chase Sunwright, and I'm the Development Coordinator at Plowshares Fund. I'm also a dedicated listener to Press the Button and an advocate for eliminating nuclear weapons. Whether you're a baby boomer, Gen Xer, millennial, or a member of Generation Z like me, I believe it's crucial that we learn about and speak up on nuclear weapons issues, because nuclear weapons affect all our lives. That's why in-depth discussions on nuclear policy and national security, like the ones on Press the Button, are so important. To help us continue our work and support the podcast, please donate to Plowshares Fund. Whether it's $5 or $5,000, every last bit helps. We rely on the generosity of supporters and listeners just like you to fund our work to foster the next generation of nuclear scholars and activists and spread the boldest ideas for reducing the global nuclear threat. As we often hear on Press the Button, our work is more crucial than ever. Please help us keep the conversation going by visiting plowshares.org and donate today.
The conflict in Ukraine has turned into a massive humanitarian crisis, as more than 2 million people have fled Ukraine since the start of the conflict a few weeks ago. Citizens who have remained in the country have been subjected to airstrikes and heavy shelling of civilian areas, with many fleeing underground to take shelter in places like subway stations. To help us understand the developing situation, we are joined by Negar Tayyar, the co-founder and director at Global Whole Being Fund, a global grant-making body dedicated to supporting people on the move. Negar, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a gift to be here with you and your listeners today.
I think the pleasure is all ours. For our listeners, today for us is Friday afternoon, right before this podcast airs. And at this point, the conflict in Ukraine has been developing very rapidly, with reports saying that as many as 4 million people could eventually be forced to flee Ukraine. Negar, can you tell us more about what you and your colleagues are seeing?
Of course, you did such an exceptional grounding. It's hard to really capture all these pieces that have been happening in such a short time. And I think to add to your grounding, given our focus on people on the move, refugees, people who are forced to flee, as within the last 2 weeks, 2.5 million people have fled Ukraine already. That's an astonishing high number, even for us who are used to work in settings like that. It's exceptional in terms of scale. And I'd like to also add that 1.5 million people have fled to Poland. So Poland has been taking the biggest toll in terms of receiving people. And based on UN data, we don't know exactly, the data is usually more conservative, it's usually higher. 1.5 million people have fled within Ukraine. They haven't left the country, but are not in their homes as of now. Somewhere in train stations have found, safety with families in different regions. So just to say that millions of people are on the move right now in this particular geography. And the other piece that I'd like to highlight is really the response has been exceptional on so many levels. The European Union has done what advocates like I would have dreamed of before we saw this happen. I mean, we always said that it's all dependent on political will. We just saw this happen right now, right? Overnight, the European Union provided exceptional levels of protection for Ukrainians and others with residence permit in Ukraine. And while we have mixed feelings about that, right? And many of us have been criticizing how there is still structural racism and discrimination. I'd like to just see, for us as advocates, it's exceptional and we are very energized around this because we see that another way of dealing with people who are forced to flee their homes is possible. It's doable, it's viable, and it's the right thing to do. So just wanted to highlight that before we get started with our conversation.
You're already taking us straight in because that was going to be my question about what you're seeing now and how it's different. I would love if you would tell us a little more about those mixed feelings that you have.
Of course. I mean, for those of us who have been dealing with this issue for many years, and there are many like myself who are personally impacted, my family fled via Poland, actually, also after the Iranian Revolution in 79. We fled in the late 80s, and one of the countries we crossed was Poland after some of the now post-Soviet countries. But I think this issue, this situation is so different because many people who never had an entry point to this issue, meaning people who are forced to flee because of war and conflict, are now faced with that fear, right? Many Europeans are saying that we could be next. Like the Polish society is right now is very concerned, and many neighboring countries say that we could be next. So I think this visceral feeling of being affected and the fear is something that we haven't seen to that degree on the European continent. And I think the other piece is why we always are controversial with the media. It's really important to highlight that it's been exceptional to see so many stories humanized, right? And so many people being followed and accompanied on their journey and portrayed in a very dignified way, more than we saw during the Syrian situation, for instance. So for people to see that people actually do not want to flee their homes, but overnight they just pack whatever they have in a backpack and then carry over their cats, right? Or carry their dogs with them as they're crossing. I think that has been really significant. We who have worked on refugee rights and advocated for their well-being, we were used to that. We knew no one wants to flee their homes unless home is like what Warsan Shiri says, the mouth of a shark. But I think for the majority of the white European population, this was new to see, and to feel it and to know that you could be next had a profound impact. But I also feel like there is another piece that is different here, because if you look at Poland, and particularly before what happened now with the Russian invasion in Ukraine, Polish has a border to Belarus, right? And we had followed over the last month that many Black and brown migrants and asylum seekers, refugees from places like Iraq and Syria were stuck at the Belarusian-Poland border, right? Thousands of people were stranded there. And there was a whole political weaponization of refugees going on as well. The bottom line was these were people who were seeking protection at the same borders, right, at the same country. And those were denied access and are still being denied access. Poland responded with pushing back people, right? And it's like 0 degrees, people are stranded in tents, they're covered by snow. A 14-year-old Syrian boy died, amongst many people who died because they froze to death. And the Polish authorities really went after humanitarians who were willing to respond and still continue to do so. And now, fast forward in this moment, right? Instead of doing what the Polish authorities did in that context, which was invest $400 million in a border that in our view is, what good use is a border in this moment, right? You see Border Patrol now at the Ukrainian border asking people, how can we support you? How can we help you? How can we make our process more efficient? Responding from a very human and driven by solidarity. So seeing that in such stark contrast in the same country that is not that large in such a short time has been also really difficult for us. But I think what we are seeing amongst advocates is really that one can't just dwell on that. And we all know there is systemic discrimination and racism that's prevailing, and that people are being treated different because of their race, gender, ethnicity, religion. But what is, I think, really vital to bring that back to that point is that we need to use how Europe is responding now as a model for how we need to respond to people, period, regardless of gender, race, ethnicity, religion. So I feel like the European Union actually did us a huge favor by saying, okay, we can elevate the standard. And now it's on us as advocates to say, let's ensure that same level of treatment for everybody.
Now, when you and I first met, it was actually in the context of the Afghanistan crisis and conflict. And I feel like, there's a little bit of deja vu here in the types of questions that we're asking, the heartbreak that we're feeling, and the wanting to respond. What does this all mean for you and your team at the Global Whole Being Fund in terms of what response you're able to do, how you all are holding up after what is yet another wave of refugees moving because of conflict?
Thank you for this very thoughtful question. And I obviously am representing a huge team of people that are all working across organizations, some within the umbrella of the Global Whole Being Fund, many within the umbrella of an organization we work with very closely, which is Choose Love, or open society foundations that are supporting us generously also with the due diligence support, and many other organizations. I think similar to Afghanistan, what has been really moving us all is the degree of solidarity and the really genuine interest in coordinating and aligning our response together. And most importantly, I think what's been really helpful here, even more so than work related to the Afghanistan response, was it's almost like every part of the ecosystem that is part of this response knows its place and what it's best at doing. And we all work in concert with one another, almost like a symphony involving a number of individuals and organizations. So for us, and some people say, oh, Afghanistan is almost over and this is happening. And we're like, no, Afghanistan is not over, right? More than 20 million Afghans are, at the brink of starvation and have food insecurity. And those issues are not covered on the news headlines, but they exist, they prevail. Michelle, you follow, and your audience does too. But for everyday people, it could feel like, oh, something just got done and we got something new. Like, no, and Ukraine is going to also become a protracted crisis, right? We know that. So was Syria, which just closed its 11th year of war. So I think for us, we have been reckoning with what are we best placed to do. And our role is really to transform the way we are responding to people who are fleeing conflict and climate devastation. And what that means is that we center frontline organizations, first responders, organizations on the ground, everyday citizens that are taking up whatever they can, may it be by making their hotels accessible for free for people, by inviting people to come to their homes, as we have seen enormously across Poland and other neighboring countries. For us, that's really at the core of it. And I think there is something to consider when you are new to this humanitarian response, which is it's a highly sophisticated structure, right, that has been built over the last decades. But we have seen with the Syrian movements that the infrastructure and the response has really shifted. Instead of relying on larger NGOs and UN agencies, bilaterals, multilaterals, many everyday citizens, people like you and me, stood up and offered what they could, and some have formalized their response in a shape of a nonprofit. Other nonprofits that were dealing with other issues related to that, like racial justice or issues around, issues concerned to their communities, stepped up and offered support too. But 99% of the funding is still going to larger INGOs and multilaterals and bilaterals. And we always say that it requires an ecosystem, bigger actors, smaller actors, all working in concert. It shouldn't be that 99% of resources are pooled in one spot, and those that are responding now are cut off from resources. So our role has been really mobilizing and organizing with others. We have joined the Choose Love team and supporting their campaign. They have a campaign that I'd be happy to share with you, which is basically aligning resources from everyday people. And I've been humbled to see $1 contributions show up a lot, everything to like 50 or 150, all the way to like institutional funders who have been backing it more significantly with $300,000 or $500,000 contributions, with the aim of it really being supporting those local actors that are responding. Because I think something that we sometimes don't see is that, as with any crisis, there are different stages, right? Our engagement is really at this very nascent stage to map out those actors. Choose Love team has done incredible due diligence in vetting those. 50 organizations have been looked into very thoroughly across the region and in Ukraine itself, and to make sure that they can access flexible funding now, while at the same time working with actors like Open Society Foundations that has a larger fund set up too, that are going to be doing midterm and long-term support. So I think for us, it's been really like the role of flying to the border, looking at things, doing due diligence, supporting the key actors behind the scenes, and trying to weave in as many people together and making sure that we are all acting as a collective in this vital moment.
And where can our listeners find Choose Love?
You could go to chooselove.org, and on the main page, you see the link, and look at it as a collective effort of many, many, many funders. It's just all placed in one spot because of the alignment purposes. Something that's really humbling. I work in philanthropy, but if there's one thing I'm extremely passionate about, it's really to get everyday people to see that they are powerful. And I did a little bit of digging because I wanted to find some data points that would support that. And I found out that 70% of all the charitable giving in the US is coming from everyday people, right? So philanthropies are only 30% of all the giving, and the giving totaled $290 billion pre-COVID. So I think really just encouraging all those that are listening also on the non-philanthropy side, as citizens, as people, as a global community, as individuals, we have enormous amount of power. Our contributions matter immensely. And we shouldn't just rely on philanthropy to respond. We should also act based on our values. And I think the other thing that I would like to highlight for your audience that you have been cultivating so beautifully over those years is that take also a broader view on displacement, right? Don't just focus on Ukrainians that are now crossing and other nationals that are now crossing into Poland and other neighboring countries. Look at our own border here at the US-Mexico border, right? The US authorities that are granting temporary protection for Ukrainians, which is by all means not ideal. It's temporary, and it means that people who are here already are able to stay for a while, but they can't bring their families, right? So it's very, very complicated and not very holistic and thought through, in my view. The same government has just pushed back a Ukrainian mother with 2 kids at the US-Mexico border. So I feel also like I would really appeal to your audience, connect these dots and look at this issue with a broader lens. And I think also realize that what we are seeing, we were just saying in the beginning, we got together, our paths crossed because of the fall of Afghanistan to the Taliban. And 6 months later, there is another big war. So this is going to happen more frequently. We are going to see more displacement, particularly because of climate. Climate displacement is actually much higher than conflict-driven displacement. So encouraging your listeners to really pay attention to these issues and to embed it into their work and thinking.
Negar, I cannot believe how time has flown. I have one last question for you before we go. This is such heavy work. And, I know the pictures, the videos, the stories can be really challenging to bear witness to. How do you continue your work? And how do you find hope in times like this?
I think an activist I read, I'm blanking on the name, said, hope is like a muscle that you need to train, right? And I do a lot of strength training. I do a lot of work that requires me to be in my body because I spend a lot of time sitting on Zoom, but during the pandemic. But I view hope as really a practice, not as something that is given. And what is sustaining me in all this is really this huge community that we have built over these years. We have such a solid support system, not just amongst colleagues and peers, but also organizations that are doing the work who we have built very close relationships with. And I feel just blessed that as someone who was uprooted for most of her life, I'm finally now rooted in a place. Thanks to COVID, couldn't move around much. And I have incredible friends and a really wonderful mother that has been supporting me in all this. I'm able to do this work because I'm being supported in so many ways that I can't even fathom. So really big gratitude for all those people who have been carrying our work and me in this very important time. And, conversations like the one that we are having right now is equally important, right? Because when you reached out, my initial instinct was to say, no, we have so much to do. We can't really. And then when you pause, you realize pausing is important, right? So I'm also grateful for peers and colleagues like you who are helping us to pause and to think and discuss what is happening, because that too is important support in this moment.
Well, deep gratitude to all you and your team are doing. Negar, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited in Washington, D.C. by Lauren Billett and Angela Kelly, and in San Francisco by Jacqueline Shing and Delphine Vigil, with research and assistance from Alex Hall, Harry Tarpey, and Desiree Zepetis. Audio engineering and sound design by Jacqueline Shing. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.